There are moments when the news stop you, not because it is political, because it is so human. And this is one of those moments. We're learning more about a devastating tragedy on Thursday involving Justin Fairfax, former Lieutenant Governor and former Attorney General of the state of Virginia, a man who once held one of the highest offices in the state of Virginia. And yet, like anyone else, he struggled, man. Behind the titles, behind the public life, there was a family, his wife and two children, just 14 and 15 years old, now left to face the reality no child should ever endure. Having lost both parents in a single unthinkable moment inside the basement of their home. That is a part we cannot ignore. Because from the outside, we assume control, stability, strength. But you know what? Life doesn't not operate on appearances. It moves in moments, moments shaped by pressure, conflict, personal struggles we often never see or hear about. There are reports of recent custody challenges, signs of a life on the strain, but the truth is, we may never fully know and understand what led someone like Justin to that breaking point. What we do know is this: something snapped inside of him. And in that moment, everything changed. In that dark moment where he could see no light, that is the sobering reality of what happened on Wednesday night of this past week. No title, no position, no success insulates anyone from life's pressures. And when someone reaches that edge, the consequences are not temporary. They're permanent. And they're carried most heavily by those left behind. This conversation now is not about politics. It is about how quickly, for all of us, any of us, without a moral clarity, without God in our lives, without somebody we can pick up the phone and call, without somebody we can turn to, life can unravel so quickly, and how a single moment can define everything that follows. C.J. Jordan is here to talk about this. She broke the story to me before anyone else reported it. I just did not have what it took to report it. It just really shocked me. CJ, what do we know, and what are your thoughts on this?
Thank you for having me, Armstrong. I think, first of all, this is a really bad tragedy for the Commonwealth of Virginia. As you reported, it is known that Justin committed a murder-suicide. Yes, he is our former lieutenant governor, a rising star in Democratic politics, but today we're talking about a human being, a father, a husband, who committed the most unthinkable act in his home in front of his children. And the question becomes, what led to that? As more reporting comes out, we hope to know if there's anybody that he had reached out to, whether it's a former colleague, a fraternity brother, to find out if he had reached out for help. And he might not have done that, or he could have. And what we're finding out is the fact that when he had gotten served papers, it just tipped him over. And so there are several different things that I think will come out of this particular tragedy here in the Commonwealth. There have been questions raised about the statute in Virginia of what is the definition of separation, because they were both living in the domicile home with their children. We know that she, based on reports, put in cameras throughout the house to ensure her safety and the safety of her children. And I can only assume through additional reporting that that was probably done on a recommendation of her attorney. And so what are we going to do going forward? How do we adjust going forward?
Well, I tell you what we should do, CJ, and I appreciate having you join us today and give us your perspective. We should pray for them, give them their privacy. The kids are with the deceased mother's parents, and sometimes the media can ask too many questions. I think eventually all questions will be answered, but at this time, we just need to give the family a chance to recover and adjust to this traumatic situation. Thank you so much for joining us, CJ. It's always a pleasure having you on.
Thank you for having me, sir.
Our pleasure. We turn our attention now to the Middle East, and there seems to be a ceasefire in place that seems to be holding, except that Iran's nuclear program is still on the table, and Israel is still a wild card. Joining us is our CIA operative. Mr. Operative, what is the latest? And thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure. The situation in Iran seems to be moving steadily, not quickly, but certainly steadily in the right direction, because there's clearly, I think, a developing crisis inside the leadership apparatus of the Iranians. The fact that they sent 71 people on their delegation to Pakistan, and the United States, as the world's only superpower, sent the vice president, who was the highest ranking American official, to meet with Iran since the Shah fell, and a small delegation of capable people with a track record of success that are in the president's orbit. But the Iranians, it's unclear who was in charge of the delegation, who thinks they're in charge but is not really in charge, and how many of them showed up. But
Mr. Operative,
not answered.
Why is that important? What is important is how fragile is this resolution? What does it mean? Is it a chance for them to pause? Is this a pause? What happens going forward? How does Israel play into it? How are the Gulf states playing into it? And what is realistic as the president moves thousands and thousands of more American troops on the ground?
I think the takeaway is that there is confusion, friction, and a sense of rudderlessness inside the Iranian governmental structure. That's what the signal says to me. That's what this activity looks like to me. They don't have anybody speaking for the government, so they sent 71 people. I think a lot of those people went because they didn't want other people there without supervision, or at least know what they're saying. There's a lot of confusion inside of Iran's leadership circle. Our delegation was very tiny. Theirs was enormous. And it's unclear how many of them actually went back to Tehran. That's a number that I don't know, nor do I know how much they brought with them. I would bet anything that there was a lot of people on that plane because they knew it would not get shot down.
Mr. Operative, none of that is relevant. What is relevant
it's very relevant.
What is relevant is how we move forward, and the Strait of Hormuz, the fact that there's a truce. How reasonable is it if the United States and Iran to reach a truce? That doesn't mean that the Houthis are going to stop firing on Lebanon. There is still wars and conflict unfolding in the Middle East.
There is confusion and violence in the Middle East. That's not a new thing, either one. The second part of that is the United States knows what we're doing. The Navy's doing it. The force structure that's out there has blockaded the straits. Commerce is moving to the Arab states that are on the western side of the Gulf, and the Iranian ports are being monitored and watched for ships coming into the straits, going to Iran with cargo, and those loading out from Iran on their way out of the straits. The U.S. is in the situation right now where they have their hands on the levers of control. The Iranians do not have control of their internal system, and they don't appear to have any control over what's occurring in the Gulf. Because whether they say they have mines or there are mines, nobody's hit a mine yet, which I find shocking that no explosions have happened. But that's a testimony to the capacity of the United States Navy and how much lying actually goes on from Iran.
So what is strange is that the Iranian government just announced that their supreme leader, the Ayatollah just succumbed to his wounds and is dead. I actually believe he was dead in the first round over a month ago when his parents were also killed in the initial attack. I just think they needed to keep that in place because of the fragility of the government. But what does that mean? And many people will say there is nothing that Iranians say, no matter how many times we negotiate with them, has any meaning to it. And they're always saying exactly what needs to be said, but doing something in terms of their actions that is quite different.
The key takeaway from that, Armstrong, is we don't know who is in charge inside Iran. We don't know who is calling the shots, if anyone. I tend to agree with you. I think the Ayatollah's son was dead, but they didn't know what to do with that. So they lied and said that he was in the hospital. Now he's dead, but 71 people in a delegation to come out to talk to the United States is absolute folly. It's a signal that they sent that there's nobody in charge. There's not a committee that big. You can't run a country with 71 people. And who do we talk to? Who's giving us a commitment that their government will follow? We don't know that. But the U.S. is in a position right now of isolating the regime, controlling the flow of commerce, and the system is calming down. There's not a lot of shooting going on. There's a lot of activity, and they're adjusting on both sides, but they're adjusting to open the flow of commerce.
So in your estimation, as we wrap this, you're convinced that Trump is winding down this war between the United States and Iran, and within a couple of weeks or so, the United States will be totally out of there, and it's just come down to Israel. And so we're just going to leave the Gulf states high and dry after creating this crisis for them. We're just going to up and leave.
Not a chance of that happening. That's not going to happen, and that's not where the president is headed. Right now, the president has the initiative, and he has momentum in his favor. That is enormously important coming out of a violent combat situation that the United States is now driving. The president of the United States has the steering wheel and is building momentum. The Iranians remain in disarray. We're not going to pull out completely. We've never pulled out completely. We're not going to leave the Arabs high and dry. We will ensure that there is safety and navigation, and global navigation remains open and flowing. And that the troop numbers that remain or what naval ships remain, those are all decisions that'll come through the Pentagon on what the policy requires in the theater. But we're not just going to pack up and come home, declare victory. That's not going to happen. Well, and the Iranians have got a long way to go.
Well, I'm glad you clarified that, Mr. Operative. I want to thank you so much always for joining us on such short notice, and we look forward to talking to you in the future.
My pleasure. Thanks for the time.
We'll be right back after this short commercial break to focus on the United States economy. We'll be back. Judge Glock, our Director of Research and a Senior Fellow at the Manhattan Institute, and our very own Steve Laffey, former presidential candidate, joins us. Let me start with you, Judge Block. Talk to us about a reset in a time of vulnerability for the U.S. economy.
Vulnerability, most especially because of the high inflation that is probably the number one reason Trump is in office right now, is the high and unprecedented, at least for the last 40 years, inflation that we endured during Biden's term. And that was gradually coming down, certainly not as much as voters or Trump himself would have liked. But this Iranian war and the blockade of the Straits of Hormuz showed a sudden uptick in inflation. And that's dangerous both for consumers, because obviously they have to pay more at the pump. They have to pay more for energy in general. But it's also dangerous for the whole economy, because now the Federal Reserve has to decide what to do about that inflation. Do they try to attack that with higher interest rates, or do they try to let that flow through to the rest of the economy? Either choice is not ideal, and either choice will certainly cause some amount of pain But that's the dilemma the war and the high prices have put the Federal Reserve in right now during a period of transition of the Federal Reserve, which makes it doubly dangerous.
Steve, prices are not just higher that many people don't talk about. Prices have been redefined. My opinion is these prices are not going down. This is a new era and a new adjustment for everyone. We just hope that the inflation and economy and trade can keep up with it so people can be able to absorb, because we're accustomed to higher prices. We've seen this before.
Yeah, prices never go down, not in America, not since the 1800s, right? So when deflation was actually a good story from 1800 to 1900, then we came up with the Federal Reserve Board, and now we are going to have more inflation, higher real interest rates, because one, we have this war, but also we have fiscal irresponsibility that's been going on for many, many years, and that's not changing at all. Why would that change? I mean, we're running a $1.9 trillion deficit. We spend more on interest on the debt than we do on defense. Even if Trump gets his way, it'll be roughly the same this year. The talk and talk and talk, what they're going to have to do no matter what. The Federal Reserve, by the way, has failed to get inflation down to their 2%, which only destroys half your wealth over 30 years. They're going to get it. They have it at 3, but if you look at last month or the month before, it's trending up higher than 3. Their preferred gauge is watching this PCE. That's above 3% now. They failed for 5 straight years, Jerome Powell, to get it down to their target of 2, which shouldn't be the target. So all this stuff is going to continue. We're going to end up having to do what we did after World War II, repress rates. Who does that hurt the most? The middle class. Who's been hurt the most by what's happened the last several years? The middle class. They're getting all these tax cuts. What are they spending it on? Oil. So oil stays, below $100 or so as we talk today. It's been as high as 116, but it's really not going down to 60 anytime soon because we have a premium put on what's happened with.
So let me inject here with Judge, because you're saying something even deeper. Judge, for decades, consumer operated within a framework of operated with, let's say, cheap capital, stable supply chains, and relatively predictable pricing. That framework, Judge, has been fractured, okay? The supply chains have been rerouted, energy markets have been weaponized, and labor has demanded its share as well.
Yeah, so if you look at basically the 40 years after 1980, you saw pretty much a steady one-way decline in interest rates. In the early 80s, the Federal Reserve had to fight the high inflation at the time with very high interest rates, peaking at around 20%, which even today with our higher interest rates seems appropriately mind-boggling. But those rates gradually came down because, as you mentioned, consumers got used to lower inflation, and borrowers and lenders got used to lower inflation. That was obviously a pretty good place for the economy to be in. It was good for a lot of savers. My grandmother bought me some savings bonds back in the early 1980s, and those had a wonderful interest rate that paid far more than anything you could get today because the rates kept going down over time as inflation came down with it.
Let me stop you a minute, though, because you're saying, let me stop you. But the result is not chaos, Judge. It's recalibration. We're recalibrating here. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, absolutely. So now, post 2020, not just the COVID disruption, which was unprecedented, the speed of the economic devastation that we suffered in that time, but the post-COVID inflation. What happened was you saw just a sudden spike of inflation that nobody, or I should say very few people, were expecting before then. And now consumers don't know if that sort of inflation is going to come back. The Federal Reserve is not as confident that they can control inflation. Borrowers and lenders need higher interest rates to ensure, protect against that sort of inflation coming back. And the whole economy has to recalibrate to deal with that new reality, which is obviously now further exacerbated by the high oil prices and the war. Although I would add that unlike previous oil crises we've suffered, we're now going into an oil crisis where the U.S. is a net petroleum exporter, thanks to the fracking revolution, which does make the pain of that much less substantial than it had been in the past.
Let me mention this to our viewers. What everyone is saying today, the markets understand this. The markets think forward. They don't think about the chaos that you think you're seeing with the stock market. In fact, the stock market is actually doing pretty well. Steve?
Yeah, the stock market is a forward mechanism for the most part, and so it's looking forward. And right now, because much of it's run by computers, by the way, you think it's the old way, it is not. So,
Well, equity markets are, in particular, are forward-looking instruments.
yes, of course. And so they're
Yes.
looking forward, and so that's why we have, and even in the oil market, something they call backwardization, where the price in the future is lower than today because they think it's going to be over. Now, the markets also look forward to something else, right?
Tell
They look
us.
forward, if you just take oil, they're looking forward that the Straits of Hormuz won't matter much in 5 years.
That's a fact.
They're looking forward to a pipeline going to the Mediterranean. They're looking forward to someone cutting their way through Oman. They're looking forward to ingenuity. That's what markets do, right? And they're having, very strong profits in many sectors. So that's what happens with markets. A whole different thing about what has
So then
to happen to
affordability becomes the central question now, not price alone.
That's right. And so affordability is really not coming back. And as Judge said, that this reset will continue. They go in long trends. And we're in this trend where you go to refinance, you own 25 apartments, you go to refinance it today. Is it more than the 7 years ago when you did? Yes. Does it hurt your profits? Yes. So there's a reset going on in every industry as we're going to have higher real interest rates because the people who run our country, the people in Congress simply, I hate to say it this way, but they don't care about the fiscal irresponsibility. The Fed doesn't care that much because they've never looked at the Congress in my lifetime in the face and said, that's your problem. I'm not going to accommodate you. That hasn't happened since the crash of '87.
So let me go back to how we started this conversation with Judge, because affordability is not just about what things cost, okay? It is about the relationship between cost, Judge, income, access, and confidence. And while a lot of people think that the president over-exaggerates and overplays, he must make Americans believe again. They need this optimism. Because listen, if you still go to the malls, you still go to stores, people are spending money. So I understand the president's optimism. And so can our environment, though, that we're in now, Judge, absorb all of this?
I think so. That, consumers in the whole have weathered a lot of pretty devastating shocks over the last couple years. The biggest was that inflation, and consumers kept spending. The problem was that what they were spending on was just so much more expensive and went up so much faster than their incomes that their actual amount of spending went down. So the Americans' consumers' households' real income went down for about 3-4 years, which again was somewhat unprecedented in the modern era, that we didn't think about, that the prices went up so much faster than the incomes that it really pinched people in a real concrete way. And no amount of consumer confidence was going to change that. And yet through that, they did keep spending. They kept the economy moving forward. And I think we're going to continue to see that again. And we're finally, at least we were until very recently, we finally saw household income peak up above what it was in 2020 again. The only thing that could cause that to go backwards is another burst of inflation, unfortunately, which I don't think we will have, but it's a little more likely than it was, say, 2 or 3 months ago.
Well, let me mention this based on what you said, because it is true, Steve Lafferty, that the new baseline demands discipline from policymakers, but guess what else? Adaptability from individuals.
Yes, and individuals are very adaptable. Our federal government's not. So the day of reckoning, those two things will meet at some point. And the day of reckoning is fairly close, where we'll have a real crisis. We have them every 15, 20 years. But, the worries about all these not little things, but whether it's private credit, which thankfully is private for the most part, maybe levered 2 to 1, not 15 to 1, like banks. There's a lot of things going on. But what we really need is some fiscal discipline, even if it's slow but sure, over the next 10 years to combat what are going to be higher prices no matter what. That's a reality
Well,
of
let
life.
me-
And we're going to have higher. Go ahead.
Let me just say this, because I'm going to close out with Judge. Let's be honest here. The reset looks different for those on the bottom, Judge.
Yeah, well, it always does. Fortunately for those in the bottom part of the income distribution, they'd actually done a little better than those at kind of the upper reaches, at least from around the first Trump administration till fairly recently. They actually did pretty good in the in the inflationary period. Their incomes kept up a little faster than those of us maybe with a regular annual salary, because those hourly incomes could adjust a little more quickly. So they've done pretty well. But in a world with a lot higher interest rates, with still a lot of consumer borrowing, especially among the lower half of the income scale, that's going to be very difficult over the long term. And there's going to be a lot of adjustments there that are going to have to happen. Obviously, there's a lot of other concerns with these short-term inflation spikes that aren't going to allow incomes to keep up, especially around gas prices. And again, like the people in the lower half of the income scale are going to have to deal with that a little more and in a little more straitened circumstances than those in the top.
Well, I'll say this as I thank my wonderful guests for joining us today. The difference between resilience and strain really lies in whether the global system continues to function or begins to fracture. That's the test. Judge, Steve, thank you both for joining us. Darius Baxter, Chief Engagement Officer, Good Projects, in the studio. When we come back, don't go away. You know, I met Darius at the Ned, and he showed an unbelievable kindness.
Don't put my business out there.
But it's true. It's the truth. You do business or whatever. But anyhow, but I found out that, you know, he runs one of the largest foundations here, where he really feed and empower people who are less fortunate. It's called the Good Projects. And I'm always interested in impact and measurable outcomes when it comes to nonprofits. And walk us through the difference that your nonprofit makes in a family life.
Certainly. I think at the root of the difference that we're making as an organization is understanding that we're working to put ourselves out of business. Particularly in this moment of time, and I know somebody with your level of expertise, Armstrong, would understand the prison industrial complex here in this country, the war industrial complex here in this country, but what is not spoken about enough, Armstrong, is the nonprofit industrial complex here in the United States of America. Every single year, hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars, and let's even assume a positive intent for those that are investing these funds. Hundreds of billions of dollars are invested in the nonprofit organizations, yet poverty continues to grow at exacerbating rates. Inflation continues to grow at exacerbating rates. And when I started this work, I made a very firm decision that if I was going to begin this work, that I needed to be working to put myself out of business. And here we are in our 10th year, and we're closer to that finish line than we are to the beginning. It's a blessing.
Well, help us then deal with scalability versus sustainability.
Certainly.
And what you just said.
Well, if you look at some organizations in this country, and I'm not pointing any fingers, Armstrong, but they take pride in saying we've been around for hundreds of years, or we've been in this neighborhood or this community for multiple decades. If I looked in the mirror and I said that to myself in relation to Good Projects, I would want to hurt myself, like honestly. And my community should be holding me accountable in a different way. If I'm looking up 50 years from now and I'm having to work in the same community, can I say that the work that I've done has honestly been effective? We as an organization have a very firm stance that by 2030 we will have sustained and put 25% of the population in the largest public housing complex here in Washington, D.C. to a point where they have a living wage. And we're well on our way to do that. But unfortunately, a lot of organizations don't operate with that same level of conviction or goal setting.
Well, then how are you able to do what others have not been able to do and have been around 100 years. Walk us through good projects.
Well, at the root of what we've been able to do is lived experience. I'm a product here of Washington, D.C., born and raised, the product of both a public school teacher in DCPS and an MPD officer in the Metropolitan Police Department. And a combination of both law and order and education allowed me to have a lot of great experiences in my life. But unfortunately, when I was 9 years old, I lost my father to gun violence. And I made a commitment to myself when that happened, at first understanding that education was my key and my tool to do anything in life. And I try to impress that upon the young people that I have the opportunity to work with today. But as I was approaching the graduation stage in 2016 from Georgetown University, I made a decision that I didn't want to be an exception to the rule for what was possible for young people, but I wanted to be the example. And like I said, here we are celebrating our 10th year with a simple mission to support youth and families that live here in Washington, D.C. to a place where they can sustain, they can live, and they can thrive. When we first got started, Armstrong, and I think this is important, particularly during an inflation period, the living wage in the District of Columbia was $80,000. And we were committed to say that we were going to support families to be able to sustain that living wage. Here we are in 2026, and we know that it's much farther, much higher than that, where average income sustain roughly around $115,000 in areas that we work in. But our goal is to support families to a place where they can own homes, where they can either own a business, they can enter into a trade, and then ultimately that their kids can go to any college and graduate with an on grade level in both math and reading.
Walk us through the success that you've had since your existence in these communities.
We've had a tremendous amount of success. To bring it full circle for the viewers that may not know about the amazing work that Good Projects do, our primary focus here in Washington, D.C. is in the Southwest Public Housing community, the largest public housing complex in Washington, D.C. And over the last 3 years in particular, even prior to the National Guard coming into Washington, D.C., Armstrong, we saw over a 45% reduction in violent crime with no shootings actually happening in our police service area over the last 2 to 3 years. Now, this is very important, Armstrong, because nowhere else in the District of Columbia did you see those type of numbers. You actually saw increases. And when you consider our neighbors in Southwest, being the Wharf and Navy Yard, you saw over 20% increases in violent crimes in those areas over the same period. So I can't say that we found the secret sauce, but we've definitely found out how to tap into community and ultimately lower the amount of violent crime that's happening. And our prayer is that it becomes a model for the rest of the city, Armstrong.
Please continue.
Well, it's a simple thing. At the end of
What is it, in terms of, what about the families, making sure that they're educated, making sure that they have values, making sure they have real self-esteem, that they want to protect their community, they want to better their community. Talk about what is it that you guys do differently, and tell us about your team and the operation.
Certainly. It comes down to, at the end of the day, Armstrong, we're not looking to be saviors. I tell all the time, we're not a pillar in the community, we're a catalyst. We started this work understanding that all the answers needed to be able to solve issues related to crime and violence, all of the issues related to poor educational outcomes, all issues related to housing insecurity, all of them lied within the brain power that already existed within the communities that we had the opportunity to serve in, both here in Washington, D.C., as well as in Nairobi, Kenya. And here we are in our 10th year proving that every single day. All we do at the end of the day is create a container, whether that's through our after-school programs and summer camps, whether that's through our feeding programs, whether that's through our seasonal activities around the holidays, whether that's through the mental health services that we provide on a consistent basis, whether it's the mentorship that we provide, whether it's the community outreach and violence interruption that we put in the community. All we're doing is creating a container and allowing the community itself to lift up and be the leaders in this work. We had a perfect example just yesterday. We had a young man, Drayon Irax, about 27 years old in the community. He was able to have 200 teens and young adults, men in particular. He's been running a basketball tournament with them for the last 2 weeks, where the city has been unable, spending millions of dollars to figure out how do we tap into the mindsets of young men in this city. A lot of times it's the government getting out of the way. And in the case of what I mentioned earlier as it relates to the nonprofit industrial complex, I don't have any ego in this game, Armstrong. For me, it's how do I put people in a position from the communities themselves to ultimately be the leaders, the guidance, and ultimately the solutions for the issues that we're seeing here in Washington, D.C.
If you had the capacity to double your resources this month, what would you scale?
If I had the ability to double our resources this month, the biggest thing would be recreating our programming around the city. You have over 80 plus recreation centers here in the District of Columbia, hundreds of millions of dollars funding the Department of Parks and Recreation every single year. Yet, a lot of that real estate, for whatever reason, sits dormant on any given day. You see the issues happening with teen takeovers here in the city right now, and people are talking about, parents are talking about, my kids don't have anything to do. But I see it every single day, Armstrong. There's no shortage of physical space. There's no shortage of bodies, adult bodies, staffed by the District of Columbia government to be able to deliver high quality programming to young people. What you often, back to the point around the catalyst, what you often lack, whether it's community organization, whether it's somebody within that space that's willing to take a risk and step out there and say, I'm willing, I'm not scared, I want to be able to touch these young people exactly where they are in their community, whether there's bullets flying or, grandma's out there with a bun cake. It doesn't matter. I'm willing to get in there and provide high quality, engaging social and recreational opportunities for young people. So,
I really respect what you're saying. Let me just tell you, I didn't know what to expect today. I'd heard much about you. And I love what you said about nonprofits, because there's so much skepticism about nonprofits. And so, what is your accountability structure?
Certainly. Oftentimes, Armstrong, it doesn't really exist. It takes a lot of discipline. You can imagine, I started this work when I was 21 years old. I had the title of CEO. The only job that I had before Good Projects, I was hauling beer kegs down in Georgetown while I was at the university. That was my professional experience. And I thought walking into this space, especially in our first year, I received a contract from the District of Columbia government, over $500,000. They really gave me my start. I guess what they would say, the rest is history. But I would have thought, giving a 21-year-old that much funds, that, there was accountability around outcomes. There would be accountability around banking and all of these different things. Obviously, it's progressed with some of the fraud that we've seen here in the district. There's definitely been more accountability structures, but oftentimes not. It comes down to the individual. How much do you care about the community that you're serving? How much do you care about the outcomes that you're delivering? How much do you care about the quality of service that you're providing? And it's sad, but that's the name of the game. And many people take advantage of that for their own personal gains. We've been blessed, and I've been blessed to understand where my blessings come from, which is the higher power. So when I cross those pearly gates, and I don't know the faith system of a lot of the viewers, but for myself, when I cross those pearly gates, I don't want to be explaining to God why I'm siphoning money out of an organization that's supposed to be supporting people. I want to be able to...
You have moral clarity.
I have very clear moral clarity. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Let me say this too. What shaped you into this role? You started at 21, you Georgetown University, you've done well, you played in an NFL, you've had such a diverse background.
Certainly.
Why this space?
Well, that's a great question, Armstrong, and not one that I get asked very often. But it truly comes down to the matriarchs that helped guide me along my journey. First and foremost, the amazing example that I had in my mother, like I shared, who's a DC public school teacher for over 34 years, former District of Columbia Teacher of the Year. And it was those moments when we would be off school or for whatever reason, and she would take us into the classroom with her, and I would just spend days with her there. And these are kids that are the same age as me. And I'm seeing just the complete different experience that we're having growing up. And it was moments after my dad died where income is now split in half in my household, and then I was experiencing homelessness and what that felt like. So going from a lower to middle class background, living in a suburban environment, now being homeless, 5 people sharing a 1-bedroom in Southeast DC, it really helped me to understand at a very young age the diversity of experiences that people had here in Washington,
You never
DC.
thought about taking this national?
Well, at the end of the day, my role and responsibility to what I talked about, the nonprofit industrial complex, is not to look to scale trouble and pain. My job is to focus exactly where my feet are, like any of us should. I've been able to mechanize that in my ability to serve, but it's to focus exactly where my feet are and say, how do I do the best job of where I am today?
I gotta tell you, your philosophy is solid. Well, brother, I appreciate it.
Thank you.
I wish we had more like you. Maybe they are. We just need to highlight them more. Thank you. We'll be back. I'm Armstrong Williams. Don't go away. Joseph Evans is a U.S. Army veteran running for the U.S. Senate. Where? At Idaho. I want to welcome him to our broadcast platform. Thank you so much for joining us, brother.
Thank you for having me, Armstrong.
My pleasure. So let's start here, Joseph. Why did you decide to run for U.S. Senate, and why now?
There's a lot of reasons behind that. One is, of course, I'm a veteran, and I'm looking at the conflict that's going on around the world, and I'm seeing that we lack a certain amount of resolution, dedication to commitment to an end state. We continue to work and push for a number of things, but there's no clarity in mission. We continue to see a lot of disruption around the United States, a lot of issues that we really need to see about resolving in a way that's positive so we as a nation can move forward.
So what are you hearing directly from voters that push you to step into this race?
A lot of it's about issues related to domestic. Housing is an issue, taxation is an issue. Our fuel costs right now, the way food and groceries are continuing to skyrocket. So I'm seeing a lot of interest from individuals that are saying, hey, my cost of living is way too high. I don't make enough to cover. I don't make enough to make ends meet. I'm one emergency away from being homeless. I'm one emergency away from being without a car. I'm one emergency away from, any number of different situations. So the goal is, for me, I want to be able to see those issues resolved in such a way where the American dollar in the hands of the consumer, in the hands of the average American, actually goes somewhere again.
I remind our audience, I've said to you that from time to time we're going to highlight people. It doesn't matter whether they're high in their polls, it doesn't matter. The fact that they're willing to make the sacrifice to run for office. And so we're highlighting again from Idaho. So, I'm curious, how has your military service shaped your view of the world today? And what do you think about what's going on in the Middle East where we deployed our military?
I joined the Army back in '94. Started out as field artilleryman, forward observer, did some combat deployments. Then 2001 happened, 9/11. And I ended up did 3 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq, deployed to the Philippines as well in the support of the global war on terrorism. And it gave me an insight into the way a lot of the world sees the U.S. and the way that we interact with it. Now, one of the problems we had with the global war on terrorism was there was no clear defined goal. We were after an ideology. We were after boogeymen that were running around the world. We got bogged down in Afghanistan, we got bogged down in Iraq, and I see the same situation happening right now with Iran. We have some sort of nebulous goal about removing terrorism from Iran, when Iran has yet to actually prove to be anything more significant in threat than our criminal cartels next door.
What separates you from others in this race when it comes to both policy and character?
Policy and character. One is I'm a liberty-oriented constitutionalist. I'm not running on a populist platform. I'm not interested in vengeance. I'm not interested in getting back at any sort of situation. I believe the greatest problem we have right now is that the federal government has exceeded its constitutional authority. And as such, it infringes upon the liberty of the people. It raises the cost through taxation in order to afford that overreach. So this comes back to the situation where let's get back to where individuals are responsible for themselves once again. And we're no longer dealing with this situation where the state has taken responsibility for the people. We get back to people taking responsibility for themselves.
It's interesting. We've covered so much in this conversation. Where do you think morality and character and lowering the temperature from the divisiveness, and we think that we each other enemies. How do we make Americans realize that we may have come here on different boats, but we're all on the same ship now, and we'll either sink together or swim together?
This goes back to Madison in his statement that the government we have is only capable for a moral and religious people. Now, that isn't to say the government has a responsibility for the morality of the people, but it absolutely is essential to give the opportunity for the people to understand and act in a moral and responsible condition and situation. So the government needs to protect the rights of the people. That is why we created it. It is up to the communities. It is up to the individual. It is up to, in a lot of ways, our religions, our churches are the ones that teach us how to treat each other nicely. It is up to the government to make sure that we don't treat each other badly.
Are the issues in Idaho radically different from those across the United States?
We have a few that we consider a higher priority than other places. One is use of public lands here in the state of Idaho. We have a significant amount of land mass. We are larger than most of the eastern states, larger than Virginia. And we have resources that have been locked up by the federal government in such a way that we can't use them effectively. We don't produce the way our land mass says we should produce. We've had to cut back on timber because of EPA, mining, similar issues, our ability to handle production from raw materials here in the state of Idaho, which is a lot of what we were founded on back in the 1800s, was the ability to produce, the ability to mine lumber, the trade craft of a young nation.
How do we get people back, especially young people, to respecting the soil, farming the land, agriculture?
We begin by getting the government out of the way, and we begin by getting the commodities mercantile exchange out of the way. Right now, a lot of where we are losing energy is because of the middlemen and the middle management. We no longer have direct from source to production. It goes through middlemen. We no longer have the ability to initiate without going through a certification process, without going through a board, applying for an application, getting legal documents lined up. We can't build without going through city planning. A lot of these things that we used to do as a young nation, where we just went out and did great things all the time. We're now stuck in a situation where we're caught up in red tape. We have to buy insurance for a plan for a program. We need to have arrangements for a business plan. The banking arrangements, the business loans, these are no longer handshake deals. You got to go through a process. And these processes continue to get in the way of the small businesses that make the people in America, and especially the people in the state of Idaho, effective entrepreneurs.
What has surprised you most about yourself and the people in running this race for the U.S. Senate in Idaho?
Most of it's my willingness to stand up. I see the issues, I see the needs, I see people wanting great things for the state of Idaho, wanting great things for themselves. And I'm beginning to grasp to a greater degree the responsibility of stewardship that I've actually volunteered to take on by running, by becoming part of this race. I want to maximize the opportunity for the people in Idaho so that they can do the things that they really want to do, so that they can follow their dreams. And I think that's an amazing thing.
And finally, and I really appreciate your joining us, in times like we are in now, what kind of leadership are Americans truly in need of and looking for?
They're looking for honest leadership. They're looking for consistent leadership. And above all, they're looking for a restrained leadership. These are the kind of things that are important because we want to be an available resource, but we still want to be a good steward of the resources of America and the people. And above all, consistent.
Well, listen,
We can't.
I cannot thank you enough for your courage to run, to make the sacrifice, and joining us today. And as all, we wish you well. I want to thank all our earlier guests, Mr. Operative, C.J. Jordan, Judge Steve Laffey, Darius Baxter, and our candidate for the U.S. Senate in Ohio. Thank you so much for joining us and the great staff here at WGLA 24/7. I'm Armstrong Williams. We're out of here.